Okay. How do you all feel about the session this morning? Give thumbs up if you thought that it was really worthwhile for you. All right. I felt that it was really worthwhile for me. I felt really good. So I'm Mary Crickmore. I work with World Renew, and I have used the materials and tested them out along with my colleagues. And so I'm going to show you about what we modified, what we think could work better in the lessons 2A, 2B, 3, and 8. And then Dana will take over and talk about the lesson 9 and the closing. So some of you are aware of the story-based curriculum. Raise your hand if you have used the story-based. Okay. For those of you who have used the story-based, this revision is going to look more like the story-based that you have been using. And as a group, we were very informed by the experience of the story-based work. So that is why lessons 2A and 2B are now two separate lessons. And 2B now has a story about listening. So that is a major change, but that came from this, because it's working well in the story-based, to do what is a wound of the heart. That really takes a whole session of an hour and a half or better to do the wound of the heart, and then the listening and the good listener and the art exercise is now its own lesson, because that takes more than an hour and a half to get that done well. I'm seeing nods, so I think some of you agree. So that's an overview of what's changed. Now I'll give you a few more specifics. So look at your page 24 facilitator manual. We have what is a wound of the heart. It used to be in the 2016 facilitator handbook that you had a definition of trauma, and you had a diagram with circles. And now instead of having a separate handbook that you've got in one hand, and then the book that you've got in the other hand, now we've put that material is in what the facilitator is looking at. And honestly, I will tell you that as I was piloting this, I had it printed in letter size and spiral bound, and I really liked that because I could just flip the page and have one page that I'm looking at and not juggling documents. So, but we have done some revision and some rewording on what is a wound of the heart, and this is pretty important. So I'd like everybody just take a minute to read through to yourself the definition, the intro about what trauma is, and then I'll warn you that the diagram that you have there is not the diagram in our revision, because our real diagram, you have loss/grief. So if you want to, with your pen in that circle, put above grief, put loss/grief. The graphics people who printed this for your use today were not able to make that change in time for you to have it in your hands. So I'm telling you to do it with your pen. So look at that definition of wounds of the heart. So basically, it's a bit expanded. We had a lot of work with the authors and people working on the exact wording of this, and some debate back and forth. but just I'm afraid to open it up for any questions or comments right now because our back and forth discussion in our committee and with the authors we spent hours, maybe, on months. So, but this is what we have come up with. And so it's a bit expanded and more detailed wording from the 2016 version. Okay, other small changes. If you turn to page 26, how do people with wounded hearts behave? The only thing that has changed here is that in the 2016 Facilitator's Handbook, there's 2 options of how to do this, and one of them has people can step into a circle if you've experienced that. Since we're designing this version to be for a newbie facilitator out to lead their first healing group, we just simplified it and we just told them do it what used to be just the option 1. If you've been using the step into the circle and that's working for you, you are not prohibited from continuing to use that, but it's just to keep it as simple as we could for the newbie facilitator, we just left in the option 1. Now we made a scripture change on page 28. Many of you know one of the verses that we've been using for people in the Bible expressing emotions was Jonah. And the reason that we took that out is because Jonah does not do well to be angry, and God asks him, do you do well to be angry? But we're trying to look for verses where people express their emotions, and this was a positive thing for people of God to do. So we have suggested that we bring in Acts 20, 36 to 38, where Paul and the Ephesian elders are weeping on the beach because they're never going to see his face again, and they have an outpouring of tears and emotions. So that the Acts 20 is there instead of the Jonah. The next thing that we did on page 29 is give some suggestions for people for the bottles underwater exercise. Sometimes you're in a place where you can't go outside and fill a big basin with water. And so for practical reasons, in some cases, people just try to keep piling different objects onto somebody who's trying to hold all the objects at the same time. If you have done that alternative method, please raise your hand. I think there's some people here who have used it. Okay, yeah, we've got already some people who have used that alternative. Now we have it in the book for the facilitator to know that there is another way to do bottles underwater. The next thing that we did on page 30, we have moved the breathing exercise here. The reason is, now that we've split the lessons, we want to have something that's calming, that can settle people down for closing of the lesson, to do something that's quieting for the participants. And so we put the breathing exercise here so that we have a nice closure for lesson 2A. And then we're going to move into lesson 2B, where we have the listening exercise and the art exercise. So now you can turn to page 34. Now, in the listening lesson, we have not changed the content, but like the lesson 1, we've cut and pasted and reorganized it. So we have, it used to say, what is a good listener and how can we listen? So now we have on the page, Okay, I thought that was page 34, but no, it's page 37 now. Yeah, we have what a good listener, what is a good listener like, and then we have the categories for the good listener. But all of this content was there before. The other change we made on page 38, instead, this is just a naming thing. Instead of serious cases, we said, what are signs that we and others need additional help? The next thing basically, both of these lessons, the content is really looking the same. Now, the only thing, there's only 2 additions now to the lesson 3, the grief journey. What we found out is that some facilitators, I don't know how many, but some facilitators doing healing groups were not acting out the grief journey. They couldn't figure out how to do it with a small group of people, or they just weren't sure. So there were a significant number of facilitators who were not doing the grief journey between the 3 villages. And so what we've done is put in a script so that if you've been doing the grief journey in a way that works really well for you, keep doing it. But if you're showing new facilitators how to do the grief journey, we now have a script. And so that script is on the pages 45 and 46 and 47. And I'm going to do a demo of the script. So does somebody have a roving mic? We'll need a roving mic for this. 2 would be good. And before we, just the only other thing for lesson 3 is that we have a new subsection on the grieving about delayed grief. And that one is on page 48. Sometimes the grief journey, the top of page 48, sometimes the grief journey is delayed. Because we know from some of our contexts that people are fleeing with their children, and they're not going to right now go through the anger, denial, and no hope, because they have got to find out how to feed their kids and how to find shelter. And so you become hyper-functioning for a time in order to survive, and then it's later on that you're going to be able to do the grief journey. So we've added that in, and it's especially pertinent for some of our situations where we have a lot of displaced people. And then also I'll note for lesson 8 that we now have, from the story-based, we have stories that you can use with the lesson 8, stories to tell before taking your pain to the cross. So we're going to just do a quick run through of what it looks like to use this new script. And I'm going to do it from memory, so don't even look at your book. Just watch what we do up here, and don't follow in the book. So I'm going to just I have some volunteers here. Ray, you're a volunteer. Yep. And boy, I can't see people's names real well. Okay, so you're the village.
That's Misty.
Misty, come on up. You're a volunteer. Yeah, okay. So Misty is the village of no hope. And Linda, you're a volunteer. You're the village of new beginning. And all that you're going to do is hold signs. Oh. Oh, okay. Okay. All right. And so now I need, I have some more volunteers here. Nonis. And Margaret. And Gineva. And Kathy. And David. Come on up. Okay, so Margaret is the grandmother, and David is the father. Gainaba and Nonis and Kathy are all the teenage or 20-something children of the family. But a terrible, terrible thing has happened. Your mother, David's wife, was out to do some shopping, and she was killed by a drunk driver. And you just got the news. So come to the first village. And Margaret, you don't believe that she's dead.
Can't be true. Absolutely impossible. Must be somebody else.
Okay. And David, you're angry with yourself because you think you could have prevented it. If you had gone to do the shopping, she would not be dead now. So you are angry at yourself.
Why she went there without me? It was me who must be there, not her.
And Gainaba, you are angry with God. Why did he not protect your mother?
God, we have been serving you for that long. Couldn't you protect my mother?
Okay. Nonis, you are angry with the drunk driver. You would like to kill the drunk driver.
Yeah, I can't imagine that he did it. I really want to do something with him.
Okay. And Kathy, you are angry with your mother for abandoning your family.
Oh, my mom, she's such a poor driver. She wouldn't notice that guy careening toward her. Oh, why did she leave us? What are we going to do without her? Who's going to take care of us all?
And all of you are, those of you who are angry, you're still in denial that she's not really dead.
Hasn't happened.
But the rest of you, if anybody walks in, you're so angry, you're all feeling so angry that a visitor walks in and you just get angry with me for no reason.
What are you doing here? Oh.
Oh, get out.
All right.
Why you are talking about?
Thank you. Now, it's been several weeks. And Margaret, because she went to the funeral, she's now accepting that her daughter is dead. But she is feeling so depressed.
Nothing's worth anything.
And Gainaba has been calming down from her anger, and she is just feeling no energy at all, doesn't want to go to work.
I don't have any energy to do anything.
Nonis is still angry. He still wants to kill the drunk driver.
Yeah, I really want to do something with him.
Okay.
I just can't. Yeah.
So he's staying in anger. Kathy, you're still angry too.
Oh, I really am so upset with my mom. Oh, why didn't she take my brother along and have him drive?
So she's staying in anger. David is now getting over his anger, and he's not blaming himself so much, but he's so sad. He's going to no hope.
So my wife is gone, but still there is a hope to meet her in the heaven.
But now you're very tired. And you're tempted, you're starting to drink a little bit more than you used to.
There is a drunk.
I can take a cigarette, but there is nothing. I take a beer, but it is still a problem.
Okay, now Gainaba has just read a news article about another person killed in an accident, and you're angry again. So you go back to anger.
What is this again?
Okay.
You are God and you let those things happen.
Okay, but now Nonis and Kathy are finally calming down, and you're coming to no hope and feeling very sad. But now David, he's putting away his cigarette, and now this is a year later. A year later, David starts to think about he can restart his life.
So I don't know the God of plan, but we can continue living. The scripture says that after this life, we can get another life.
So we go to new beginning for David. And Margaret, you are thinking about taking care of your grandchildren and your responsibilities at church, and you're going to also go to new beginning.
Yes, there's lots to do now. These kids are growing up well and things are looking up, and having a lot of fun at church with some new organization that I'm helping with. So,
Okay. And Kathy also is starting to take more interest in her schoolwork and her studies, and she's thinking about her career. And although she misses her mother, she's going to also go to new beginnings.
I really miss my mom, but now I really need to honor her by getting serious about my life. Go to school and show her that I can do things that made her happy.
Okay. Margaret just heard an article about a drunk driver, and you're going to go back to anger.
I want to get those drunk drivers. And I think there should be a new law that they go to prison for the rest of their lives.
Okay, but now Gainaba and Bakiono have had some weeks to think about things and recover from their anger. So come on back to, Margaret can go back to new beginning, and Gainaba can go to no hope. And now we're going to let Nonis now he's worked through some forgiveness and thinking through, and he's now thinking about his life and going forward in his life.
Yeah, I can't stay, and I know that I need to forgive and I need to go forward. So I forgive him in Jesus' name.
And Gainaba, where are you now? Are you still in no hope?
Well, I think I should move on.
Okay, but it's been a year and a half, but you move on.
Yeah.
Okay,
I should move
now it's Christmas time, and Mother isn't here. So let's all go back to no hope. It's so depressing, Christmas time without her.
on. Oh, it is sad. Mom is no longer there. We could have made a very nice Christmas, have gifts and all that.
So after a time of sadness at Christmas, now they think about their lives and their work and their church and their activities, and they come back to New Beginning. So that's what the script, it's kind of what the script looks like. And so you've seen a sample.
Thank you. So as Mary mentioned, in Lesson 8, the Pain to the Cross lesson, you can turn to page 54 to get there. Thank you. She mentioned before doing that grief skit that Lesson 8 has just one major change. And it's that there are 2 stories that have been included at the front of Lesson 8 now, Pain to the Cross. So if you'd like to use a story there, you're free to do that. They come from various sources. I believe one came from the story-based, and that's the goat story. You'd see that on page, I'm sorry, I was jumping ahead to Lesson 9 in my head. Thanks. Page 57. The Jesus Sets a Woman Free, a beautiful retelling of the Mark 5 story where Jesus is healing the woman who's bleeding. And I tried this out in a healing group, and it worked so beautifully, starting the lesson with this, and then the discussion questions at the end, and then flowing right into the Pain to the Cross ceremony. It was just a really lovely way to start. There's also, as you see at the bottom of page 57, Pastor Mark's paper, and that's continuing that thread of Pastor Mark that started at the very beginning. So if you'd like to use that, you can as well. That's the only main change in the Pain to the Cross. Some may notice in the Pain to the Cross ceremony that the section 3 that's on page 60, the scripting looks a little different than the previous one. It's incorporating a lot of the story-based version in that. So it's not a new creation, it's taking something from a different part of the trauma healing materials and incorporating it into this. So when we get to the How Can We Forgive Others, that's lesson 9, page 62 in your facilitator's manual. And for those of you who are able to multitask with papers, and all of you probably are because you know how to juggle the facilitator handbook and the Healing the Wounds of Trauma book, but we had given you that piece of paper that said 2019 revision, overview of changes. That lists line by line everything that we're sharing with you right now. So you don't feel like you have to frantically take notes about all these changes. Later on, you can just spend some time going through this bullet by bullet. And so I'm at the bottom back half of that page, lesson 9 right now. One thing I'd like to point out about the way page 62 is laid out, and this is the same in every lesson. We have that section at the top of each lesson saying, before you begin. This is the stuff you need to do before you start the lesson. It's about materials that you need to gather, skits that you might need to photocopy, volunteers that you should talk to before you actually get to that part in the lesson. There's also something, you'll see the 4th bullet down says, if you will not be distributing the participant version to your participants, make a copy of the Bible verses on page 77 for sections 3 and 4 and cut them in strips, or prepare paper slips, index cards with the Bible verses. So flip to page 77 just so you can see what I'm referencing. As we prepared this revision, we were very conscious of the fact that this material is used in such different contexts. Sometimes it's used in a healing group, seated at the base of a tree in a rural area, where nothing is really passed out. The facilitator may have the only materials in their hands. Other places, it's used in a seminary classroom where there's books everywhere and all the students have lots of books. So we were conscious of the fact that facilitators want to use this material in different ways because they have different needs. So if you are a facilitator who cannot distribute materials to your participants because there either isn't money or the people aren't comfortable enough reading to have all of their own material printed out, you could copy the Bible verses in advance that are going to be used in the discussions, cut them up in strips, and distribute those. We know that other places don't want to hand out pre-printed Bible verses because they want their people to be able to look up the verses in their Bibles and get familiar with that. You can use it however you want as a facilitator. Just because they're printed doesn't mean you have to do it that way. We're just trying to give you as many options as possible for all the different contexts in which this is used, okay? The last thing I would like to say about that before you begin on page 62 again. The last section of bullets says, if this will be the last lesson in your healing group, consider how you will wrap up the group after the closing lesson. We've found that because this material was so often used in trainings, and the facilitators that were using it often would go from the end of lesson 9 into, now the participants at the training are going to take a test. And now we're going to do the logistics lessons. That then when those same facilitators planned a healing group, they didn't think about what they needed to do at the end of the lesson. That was my experience. I led a healing group. I got to the end of lesson 9 and went, I haven't thought about the fact that this group of people are not going to see each other again. They don't have a day and a half more together. I needed to have planned in advance. How are we going to bring some closure? How can they connect and pray for each other? We can take a group picture. So that's why we've listed some ideas on page 62 about things you could do at the end of lesson 9. You could lead the participants through the looking back section, which is our concluding lesson, and I'll lead you through that. You could sing a song. You could let them pray for each other in small groups, exchange contact information, have them sign the group authorization form. We noted that. Have them fill out the healing group feedback form or ask what's the one thing you most want to remember from this group. So this is just a way to help you plan ahead for the ending of your group. All right. With that, so you'll see on page 63, we have a new story there as an option, the goat story. On page 64, there's a story option, Anne forgives Joe. Then on page 65, there's the forgiveness skits that you're used to. So you can choose how you want to start lesson 9 on forgiveness. When you flip then to page 66, section 2, what is forgiveness and what is it not? We start that section with the question about common sayings about forgiveness in your culture. That used to be after the time when people are discussing what is forgiveness, what is not forgiveness not. We wanted to start with the culture conversation and then flow into what does the Bible say about it, which is the same pattern in the other lessons. So that's the reason for just moving that question. Then the true and, or not true and false, but question 2 at the top of page 67. This was the section that you would say to your group, this side of the room is going to discuss what forgiveness is. This side of the room is going to discuss what forgiveness is not. The only modification that we've suggested now, based on the way certain facilitators have been doing this, is kind of make it a true and false conversation, that you would assign some of these bullet point statements to groups of participants and have them discuss, what do you think about this statement? Is it true? Is it false? So I want us to take just a couple minutes and try that out. With your partner, someone right next to you, choose one of those bullet points in the list and discuss, do you think this is true or false, and why? I'll give you 2 minutes to discuss that with a pair or a group of 3 if that's easier at your table. Thank you. So normally in a healing group, I would now take time to listen to all that you had discussed. After listening for 5 minutes or however long you need to listen, we've added a definition of forgiveness in this version. In the previous version, there was the list of what forgiveness is and what's it not, but we didn't have a definition, and we heard from all around the world, will you please include a definition? So this is our attempt at it based on what we heard. Forgiveness is a decision we make to give up the right to judge or bring revenge. It acknowledges what has happened and how it has affected us. It's an ongoing process of repeated decisions to forgive each time we remember the offense. It doesn't require us to trust the person again nor release them from the natural consequences of the offense. Okay, so it's just pretty much a summary of what those bullet statements were. Section 3, how can we forgive others? That section used to have 4 subpoints. It now has 6 subpoints to it. Not new content, just a moving of the pieces around. Section B, subsection B on page 68 says, remember how much God has forgiven us. That content used to be in the next subsection underneath forgiveness shows that we understand Christ's sacrifice and our salvation. We used the same content, but we just had a different topic sentence under it. Then on page 70, you'll see letter F down at the bottom. That's a new subtopic, but it isn't new content. Determine if and when you're able to trust the offender again. That used to be part of allow time for the process. Allow time for the process was just a really long section, so we wanted to take this very important part and make it its own subsection. I'll have you flip back to page 68 just to note one thing. Bottom of page 68, D, allow time for the process. We've included a skit that came from, at least I believe it came from Mary Crickmore. It had been used a number of times, the cell phone skit. So I thought we might be able to act that out a little bit. Since I've not done this before, I'm going to have Mary act it out while I narrate it. In this, when you'd be doing a healing group, you would actually have distributed these sections and discussion questions to 6 different people or pairs. And each group would discuss, and then they'd share with the whole group. This group would get to prepare a little skit. So I will read this. Elizabeth was robbed. The robbers took money, cell phone, and damaged a lot of her things. She spent some time in the village of denial and anger. Then she prayed, God, I know you want me to forgive the robbers. Please help me. She takes 5 steps forward in the forgiveness process. Then she has to stand in line for 3 hours to get a replacement cell phone. She feels very angry at the robbers. 3 steps back. Then she prays again for God to help her forgive. 5 steps forward in the forgiveness process. Then her child comes to her and needs money for school supplies. She doesn't have it. She feels more anger at the robbers. She prays again for God to help her forgive. 5 steps forward. 2 months later, it's Christmas. She does not have the money for the gifts and the special food that she usually does every year. She feels the anger. 3 steps back. And she prays for God to help her forgive. 5 steps forward. On the anniversary of the robbery, she is able to pray to God without feeling the old anger. Good snarling. So that would be a way to illustrate that it is a process. And then you'll see on page 69 where we have the drawing of the bird. We had so many people say, we really like the drawing, but we have no idea what it means. Can you add a description of this? Because I've heard it described in very different ways. So we have added a description there. You'll see about halfway down the page, that block of black text. Halfway through it, it says, like the bird in the diagram below, we may circle back many times in our hearts towards the cage of the offense. As we forgive again and again, eventually we'll feel less pain when we remember the event. Just like the bird flies higher and further from the cage toward freedom, we move increasingly toward freedom each time we renew our commitment to forgive. So hopefully that will provide a little bit more guidance in what that diagram means. All right. Please. Thank you. That wording you'll see in the upper right corner of the bird diagram, it says complete forgiveness. It's just going to be forgiveness, right? Because forgiveness is a process, and even if we haven't felt complete forgiveness, that doesn't mean that we haven't made a lot of progress in the forgiveness journey. So that will be a slight modification on that. All right, then page 72. We're almost to the end. You guys have done a stunning job. I don't see anybody falling asleep, and this is the after lunch sleepy time. Bottom of page 72. This is an interesting one. B. Our subtitle there says, Jesus tells us to forgive others. That title used to be, in the previous version, Forgiving Others Allows Us to Receive God's Forgiveness. That section has been a potentially explosive section in terms of the conversations that emerge in healing groups and trainings. It is a difficult teaching. It's one that takes time to unpack. The slight change that we've made is to focus in on the fact that Jesus tells us to forgive. You can see that at the top of page 73. That shows that we understand that we've been forgiven by God. God wants us to get rid of bitterness and forgive others as he forgives us. That's all content from the 2016 version. Here's where, in that next paragraph, here's where we talk about the warning that Jesus gives. Jesus gives stern warnings to those who refuse to forgive. And then we quote the parable of the unforgiving servant. He teaches us to pray, forgive us the wrongs we've done as we forgive the wrongs that others have done to us. So that's the slight modification in that part. We're still getting at the same idea, but we wanted to point people to that Matthew 18 parable where Jesus' context, or his statement, is within the context of that parable. All right, we're very close. Page 70. Why am I going 70? It is because I made a mistake on the list of revisions. You have to jump back. On page 70, let the offender face the consequences of their action. The third paragraph in the bold font, it's just two sentences. This content was taken from the end of this lesson. Do you remember how at the end of this lesson there was a section that says, how can the church help people repent? We've had a lot of concern about that section because a lot of us either have experienced or know people who have experienced churches that do church discipline in a very bad way. And so we wanted to acknowledge that fact. We didn't want to just get rid of the section on church discipline because it's so important for a trauma victim whose church didn't stand up for them and didn't respond well to be able to hear that the church should have stood up for you and has a responsibility to stand up for you and protect you. So what we've added to page 70 there, the third of the bold font paragraphs, about 2/3 of the way down the pages, God has charged church leaders to protect the innocent too. They should never ignore or cover up sin, but need to address it honestly. And then we have some verses in there. That's all underneath the context of let the offender face the consequences of their action. Page 74 now. We have a new subpoint based on feedback that we received that in almost every healing group and every training, the question comes up about self-forgiveness. What if I'm having a hard time forgiving myself? This is a big topic. There are many different opinions on it, and we tried to choose a way of phrasing things that would address many different concerns and be broad enough that people could benefit from it. So we have a top-up or an intro sentence where we just have the question, some people continue to feel guilt, shame, and regret, even after doing all they should to repent and make restoration. How could these passages be helpful? We'd have a discussion of those verses, and then we have a paragraph to top that up about sometimes our feelings can make us feel far from God, and we can ask God to help us start to process those feelings, and we are going to need other people perhaps to help us through that process. It can take time, and there can be real deep roots to why we're struggling to receive God's forgiveness. But over time, our feelings can change to match what we believe in our heads. All right, I want to show you one additional little skit. You'll see at the very end, page 75, we've got the rope skit, the supplemental rope skit, and the supplemental cloth skit. A lot of skits for when you're illustrating how important it is to forgive. So I just need two people that don't have to say anything but just get to twist a piece of cloth really tightly? Who feels like they want to just get some energy out of their muscle? Nobody. Shall I just choose? Christina does, and Brian does. Very good. So, this is just an illustration. You can get a piece of cloth or a towel. And I think, Margaret, you were the one who suggested, include this. I've actually never seen it. This is my first time of seeing it. So we'll imagine that this is supposed to be a picture of what happens when we do not forgive. We have Brian, we have Christina. Brian offended Christina in some really serious way, and she's already glaring at him. She begins to twist the cloth. And she keeps twisting, and she twists more and more and more. She's starting to feel the tension in her body, too. Her stomach is starting to not keep going. Apparently, the cloth is supposed to start knotting up. That's what my book says. Here it's happening. Look at what's happening inside her body. Her stomach is getting knotted. She's getting headaches, right? There's argument. She wants to get revenge. What has to be done to get rid of the knots? Somebody's got to let go, right? One person at least has to get... It's not going to be me. It's not going to be him. So one person at least has to let go of the cloth. It's going to be hard. This will be a process for Christina in forgiving this man, right? So eventually, Christina will decide, my well-being is better than this. She lets go of the cloth, and it unwinds, doesn't it? Real quickly. Yay! All right, good. So the Bible tells us, dear friends, thank you, don't try to get even. Thank you, you guys. Let God take revenge. In the scriptures, the Lord says, I'm the one to take revenge and pay people back. So we do need to let go of the unforgiveness and leave the person that hurt us in God's hands. Then we move forward in God's plans. Okay, so there's something small you can add on to that part. All right, my friends, we are right at the very end. That means that page 79 would be the last thing to point out to you. This is the looking back section. If you finished lesson 9 and you still had time and it was your last lesson of your healing group, you could add on this 25-minute section, or you could wait and a number of weeks later, you could gather your group together again when they had time to perhaps have some more extended fellowship, and you could go at a more leisurely pace through this looking back section. You can see that the objectives are, in this section, we'll illustrate visually the trauma healing journey we've taken and will continue to take, and discuss how we've begun to make sense of our faith in God in the midst of suffering. So then page 80, there's just 2 parts. You as the facilitator start by drawing the healing journey diagram, explaining it, and then inviting a conversation. Number 2, how does God use suffering in people's lives? This is where you've got 2 discussion questions. You give people time in pairs to discuss how has God used suffering in your life, and then read the verses and discuss how God has used suffering in people's lives. This is that brilliant content from lesson 1, moved to the back so people have had time to walk through more of their own healing journey before they start discussing how has God used suffering in my life. Our hope is that people feel more safe to enter into this conversation at this point and perhaps have a new perspective about the way God has started to bring deeper healing. I believe that is it in terms of the major revisions in these core lessons. Before we do these last 30 minutes of getting questions from you, I want to point out the survey that we handed out. Can you find that 4th item that we handed out to you at the beginning that had 10 questions, survey questions for you? After you pilot these lessons in a healing group, right? Not in a training. Can anyone tell me why we would not use these lessons in a training right now? Anyone? Yes. They are subject to change. Absolutely. So if we train a room of people in something that is subject to change, and then they go out and they replicate it, and then it changes, that's not good stewardship of the materials or the people who are going to be receiving it. So this is just for you to go and lead a healing group. Then if you would be so kind after you finish that healing group to spend 5 minutes to answer those questions. Most of them are the simple, do I agree, disagree, strongly disagree, and then a few places at the bottom where you could fill out free-form answers. You can scan that then back to me. My email address is in there. We can also email you an electronic version of this if you would prefer to type it out in a Word document and send it. That's all. So now I think we have time, 30 minutes worth of time for questions. Phil's going to moderate that.
Just have some conversations at the tables. Just to talk about what did you see, what did you like, what do you have questions, was confusing. Just share amongst your tables. We'll give you probably 6-7 minutes just to start talking about that. Then we will begin listening to each other as well, okay? We gave you a quick run through this. We first started out with the rationale for this and how we began the process. That really, much of what you see in here are innovations that people have tried someplace and found helpful. And we're bringing that and we're trying to make both the international and the North American books be more similar in the material and content in that. So we brought in story-based, as you've heard, trying to, again, make it more user-friendly, especially for the new facilitator. So you've heard all those things. Now talk at your tables. What did you notice? What did you like? What was confusing? This is where you get to begin. Okay.
On page 47, up at the top, under D, where it says the grief journey is not always direct, you'll see that the second paragraph under that is about getting stuck too long in village 1 or 2. So that's that, again, beautiful content that was in the revision before. It's just part of the subsection, the grief journey is not always direct.
There's a back there.
Maybe I missed this also, but I just wondered about the forgiveness ceremony.
Yes, the forgiveness ceremony, just a minute, on Thursday, I deleted it out of this one when I realized, wait, we're just having people pilot the core lessons that have been revised, and we haven't touched the forgiveness ceremony. No changes were forecasted in that, so that's why I decided to remove it and not have us spend time on it. Great question.
Other questions, comments, reflections?
Thank you. On the question of
the question was, when will these be ready? That's a great question. When will you be giving us feedback? In May, we will be including, of course, the authors, and our revision team will need to be powwowing and discussing the feedback that we're getting from these things. Here's what we know, that there are a lot of innovations, and some will stay, some won't stay. You'll probably find things that, oh, my favorite thing isn't there anymore. I think Mary's comment before was, it doesn't mean you're prohibited from doing some very good things that have been there, right? But we're trying to have some consistency. But we hope before Jesus comes back, unless he's coming back tomorrow, then I don't care. No, but we hope by 2020 that we would have an English version here. At this year, we would have that. And then, of course, that is a ripple effect for getting other versions updated. Here's a question first here.
okay, in my country, the experience I've had with some church leaders, or when you're training and you ask, what does your culture say about God, and what does the Bible say? Most of them have had the Bible as their culture, so they find it difficult to compare their culture and the Bible, because the Bible has been all their life. I don't know what we can do about
Well,
this.
let me ask you the question, because you may not be the only place where this happens. So what do you do in order to help people look at and think of culture, not just in church culture, but other contexts?
What we've done is to help them know that actually we have the Bible, and then we have the culture that is everywhere, even those that do not believe in the Bible. What is that they believe in that is different from the Bible? I don't know whether that helps.
Well, yes, getting people to think about beyond just, do we always reflect the biblical culture or the culture of the Bible or what we're seeing in those texts, or have other things come in, right? Yeah.
Let me also note on page 10, for the first time that culture comes up in the core lessons, about the middle of the page, what does your culture tell you God is like? We have a note to the facilitator, if needed, clarify that culture can be country, region, ethnicity, church, family, etc. So at this first place where culture is mentioned, the person needs to give some explanation. When I say the word culture, I'm talking about what do all the people in your town tend to say about this.
Good point.
So some good explanation the first time you introduce the term culture.
We have a question from the live stream digital folks
Great.
that we're going to put up in a minute.
The skit with the cloth. We also say for reconciliation, both sides must drop the cloth. Good. Yeah, really good. Thank you for whoever submitted that online.
We have one in the back. Nope.
Are we supposed to answer a lot of those?
You can choose room or
Do we know how
Mentimeter.
many are there coming in
We
from?
will not get through all of them.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, let's do
Let's
do
do
this
one,
one
one
too,
here,
right?
and then we'll go to the back
Can
of the
you
room.
provide the skits in the portal as individual printouts? It's a nice idea. Yep.
Okay, question in the back of the room.
Someday be able to do that.
Congratulations, because you have included stories. Our culture is used to listening to stories. And this helps us to overcome many problems in the group. What we have to do now is learn how to tell these stories. That can really help a lot in a person's life to get some of the things out.
Good. Thank you. Right, did you? Okay. Is there another one up here?
If we have questions before we do a pilot, who would we talk to? That's a great question. My initial thought, and you guys can answer. If you are part of World Renew, I would think send the questions to Mary. If you're part of SIL, to Brian. If SIM, to Stacy Conard, who's and Nancy, right. If you're not part of an organization, one of those organizations, then
send it to Dana.
And Dana's saying, D. Walcott at American Bible. Other comments or questions? Another one in the back? What was your name, Maurice? Okay.
In the skit of the village, is it mandatory to use the 5 people? Because I
No.
think that you lose something when you do that.
Yeah, no, it is not mandatory. This is designed if somebody has a very small healing group and they wanted to do the skit to show them that you can do it with only 5 people. But you can do it, there's many ways to do it.
I wanted to ask about the man who said something about stories. Were you referring to the stories that are in, or stories that people will tell about their own trauma?
Back to the. Mhm.
I was referring to the stories that you have included that have already been revised and are already on their way to what we need.
Great. Yeah, just want to reinforce that there's a section there, I think it's on page 3 or 4, giving you different ideas of the ways to deliver those stories, because how you deliver those stories can have a better impact than just simply reading it.
We have a question in from the live stream. This new version brings with it a huge need for translation. Are you inviting volunteers to tackle this, or do you have translators lined up for various languages already? Excellent question. I know already from conversations that our Ecuadorian facilitators are volunteering to do a quick translation of the Spanish version, using the 2016 Spanish translation and just comparing it to this, because so much of the content is the same. And they are going to hope to use it in a healing group maybe 3 weeks from now. We would love it if some of the French speakers would be able to talk together, and if any of you either have the ability to do a translation in French or know of someone that could do that, we would welcome it. The only reason that we couldn't hand you a Spanish version and a French version right now is that this just got finished on Friday. So again, if the French speakers want to get together and talk about how might we get this done so we could pilot it, we would love to get feedback from the French-speaking world, the Spanish-speaking world, and the English-speaking world, even in this pilot.
One thing that we should figure out how to provide these folks is a Word document with the track changes so that they can just go through, take the 2016 their Word document and see what are the places that get cut and pasted and what are the places that get modified.
So I'm a little confused. This is a pilot, and you said something about a date in May, that it's not really, it's still in flux, it's not dried cement.
Very much.
And then now it sounds like you're also going to want translations in French and Spanish. And then that's for the pilot, because just if you start revising translations and then you go to the translator, a month later and say, oh, well, it's all changed again, they tire a bit from that. So I just want to, what are you saying, that all languages like Kinyarwanda, or so some people should translate it and pilot it, but others should wait, just use the English and not pilot it until it's finished?
Yeah, I could speak to that. There's different kinds of pilots that you could do. So if you have a group of other trained facilitators around you that you're connecting, you can pilot that actually with facilitators. It doesn't have to be in a healing group with people who have never experienced healing the wounds of trauma. So if they're all conversant and able to read and engage in English, then you could do that. That's a kind of pilot that will give us good feedback. It sounds to me that there are some who are willing to do quick translations in order to be able to pilot it in Spanish. That's great. We understand that that isn't going to become a finished book and a finished, because there's changes that will be quite afoot, right? So it's going to take some time. Obviously, we're not going to translate in a lot of places because that becomes too much work and would tire people very much. So,
Yeah, in relating to this question, so if somebody out there wants to volunteer to translate something, who should they contact?
it's a great question.
Dana.
We have a question here, Thaddeus.
Yes, I just want us to refer to page 48, F, about sometimes the grief journey is delayed. So in the facilitator's guide. So I just wanted to, in lesson 2, when we are beginning to, the current material lesson 2, when you are looking in terms of how do you have someone who has heart wounds, there's an explanation where it says delayed trauma. And now here we bring out the aspect of delayed grief. How do you bring that clarity? Because on here you have been able to bring out aspect of delayed grief, and the context is for displaced persons. Now suppose they're not displaced, because I don't know how you will tell somebody that sometimes it's necessary to set aside losses in order to survive. I don't think people plan to set aside.
They do.
In our context, they don't plan to set aside. The circumstances does not even allow them to know whether they are setting aside or not. It's just the nature of life. They find survival just as they move on. So I don't know how to bring clarity to that and the aspect of delayed trauma to differentiate the two.
I think there is times when we do plan. It's like, I've got 5 kids. My wife just died. I got to take care of these kids. I don't have time. I will grieve later. I don't have time to really let myself grieve because I've got these 5 kids and I don't have any way of taking care of them. I've got to make sure that they're doing okay first. That is a delayed grief.
Dana has a...
We could just change the first sentence there to say sometimes people set aside losses in order to survive.
Take away the necessary.
That they do that.
Yeah. Yes. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
In terms of that idea of somebody volunteering to translate, let's just stick with English, Spanish if possible, and French if possible. Because even if there are people from lots of language groups saying, well, we could translate it too, it's going to create a workload of, if I'm the one answering the emails, honestly, I'm not going to be able to be responsive enough if we've got all of these different people wanting to translate these pages, and then everyone will be frustrated. So since this is still very wet, let's just stick with those 3 language groups if we can get them, and we'll get really good feedback from that. Is there a reason why the 3 principles of well-being are not included in the new facilitator handbook? We actually, this is just the core lessons. It's not all the rest of the stuff that goes along with the core lessons, the handbook. So as a revision team, that's our next big job, is the handbook.
Other questions? David.
On page 80.
80?
80 or 18?
80.
Yep.
So we have discussed about this arc, the journey of healing. So when you see, well, the suffering start at the same time, at the same level of resilience. So we are thinking about this, we can draw this process at a different way. To have a start of suffering and to get somewhere.
Right. This was a conversation that we have heard. Maybe it generated from Rwanda, but we have heard this conversation that for some, this visual of the arc looks like you start in a low spot and you end in a low spot. That somehow the mountain was at the top and you end up in a bad place again. Maybe we need some of your artistic renditions to come up with some other ways to visualize this healing way.
I do know that we have had responses that say they really like the arc. So I think it may depend on the culture. It may depend on how it's interpreted. So,
yeah.
Margie should really speak, but it comes from the idea of writing a story where you have the high point of your story, everything's building to that high point, the crisis, the climax, which is the cross of Christ. It doesn't mean you're going back to the same traumatic state. You don't go there and then return back. You go on.
Yes.
We have a question from the live stream. They were looking for a little more clarity about taking the grief journey, and earlier had made a comment about the grief journey as something that happens rather than so much of as a choice, and any comments that you could have around that. Thank you.
Yeah, I always think of it as it's telling generally a normal process that people go through. It's not like one day you wake up and say, I'm going to be angry, and the next I'm going to wake up and have no hope. But it's a way of visually showing what generally people go through when they go through grief, and the fact that it's not completely linear. You come back, but these are three basic phases of grief, but it's not necessarily a decision you make to go to it. It's what actually happens.
I know that those watching on the live stream don't have this material to look at in front of them, unless they're some of the few people that we were able to get emails out to today. But so if you don't have that, the person who wrote that question, we do have an introductory paragraph for those who have it, bottom of page 43. There's text there that talks about how grieving takes time and energy. It's often like a journey that takes us through several villages. Each person spends different amounts of time in the villages and goes back and forth at different times. But if we allow ourselves to take the journey, it will lead to. And then there's also some content right above that in the definition of grieving that talks about how that is the normal process of recovering from a loss.